believe, 19th century French novel translated to English.
Oh, cool.
It's actually a bit of a love story.
I've started the one that you left in the house, Generation X, Douglas.
Oh, okay.
And the Eleanor Rigby one too, but it's around the house.
Yeah, I started reading that to get a better understanding of Generation X, which I'm not part of. And then I stopped reading it. So I don't know. I don't actually know anything about the book.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. All right, Steve. Whenever you're ready, you can start.
Okay, great. Well, first, let me thank Matt and Amy and the Tiny Cupboard for putting on this virtual philosophy salon. It's good to see you all. I appreciate you coming out and your interest in my work. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about my book. Here it is. I got to hold it up. Developmental Politics: How America Can Grow into a Better Version of Itself. So the book is focused on evolving American politics. Focuses on America, even though much of what is in the book applies to the developed world as a whole. In order to talk about politics, politics are still framed by a national kind of milieu. So I'm talking about American politics, but I don't mean to be too myopic about America. The main concern of the book is the dysfunctionality of American politics, particularly hyper-partisan political polarization. And that the impact of this has not only made much of American democracy dysfunctional, as I argue in the book, it's also partially responsible for the election of Donald Trump and Trumpism. In other words, Trump's partially a symptom of the fact that our politics have been gridlocked and our culture has been bitterly divided for coming on decades now. So this is an existential problem, which the book addresses. There's really sort of two parts to it, two focuses. The first part is on a politics of culture, with the idea that the problem of hyperpolarization is really, it's primarily a cultural problem that's arising upstream from Washington, D.C. So trying to focus on the politics of the federal government or the electorate, that's something that will continue to be broken and dysfunctional until we can sort of address the cultural roots of the problem. And so part one focuses on that. The second part of the book is called Toward a New Political Philosophy of Purpose and Progress. In other words, rehabilitating the idea of progress without going back to just a mainstream narrative of growth of the economy. In other words, we have to redefine progress in ways that can be more inclusive and something that people from across the political spectrum can endorse. And so the political philosophy is my favorite part of the book. It's the most intellectually challenging part of the book. It's a little difficult to land in a half an hour's sort of overview, but anybody who has read Developmental Politics and wants to talk about some of the more fine points of the philosophy in part two, of course, I'd be keen to talk about that here in our discussion. So like I said, I'm going to talk about the book for until 6:30, about half an hour, 8:30 there ET, and then we'll have half an hour for questions and comments and discussion and just hopefully a group interaction. So quickly, the background of how I came to write this political book. I was born in 1960, grew up in Los Angeles, was very attracted to the counterculture, a little too young to be part of the mainstream hippie movement, but in the 70s, I adopted a countercultural identity in a thorough way. I got to be about 19 and I realized that I wanted to make a contribution to the larger society, even though I was still aligned with the continuing emergence of progressive culture and progressive values. But I went to law school so that I could sort of gain the establishment credentials I needed to have an influence. That led to a career in business, but basically by the year 2000, I came to realize that progressive culture, the progressive culture that I had identified with my entire life, was it had reached the point where many of its political goals were failing to be achieved. So I wanted it to further the political goals of progressivism, help progressivism. And so the first focus is I've been working since about 2000 on integral philosophy. I'd written several books. It's a philosophy that focuses on the evolution of consciousness and culture. How does humanity evolve? What does that mean? What does it mean for history to make progress, right? How can we evaluate that without being Eurocentric, or without falling back on Victorian notions of cultural superiority, right? How can we take all of the important strides about understanding culture that has come from the emergence of progressivism and progressive culture, and build on that further? And so I realized that my colleagues and I realized that one of the most useful things about this integral political perspective, this new understanding of the evolution of consciousness and culture, was that it could help politics. It could help America evolve its politics to be more inclusive and more functional. And that led in 2012 to us founding a think tank. A think tank is kind of an unfortunate term, but it's a way of talking about an intellectual organization focused on politics that the media can understand. And myself and a variety of colleagues and some benefactors got together, formed this think tank. Our first focus was on climate change. By 2012, climate change had really become a political football. In other words, that it became almost a litmus test for where you were politically. Instead of it being recognized as a global emergency that everyone should care about, as Thomas Friedman used to say, that green should be the new red, white, and blue, that it should be sort of the cornerstone of every American's political agenda. But unfortunately, it's become something that is now at least identified as an issue that is near and dear to the hearts of progressive people and left-wing people. And that, in a sense, has allied people on the right against it, against their own interests. So climate change was something we worked on for about 2 years. But we began to see that part of the reason that climate change, that aligning the country and the government and the economy toward a more serious approach to ameliorating carbon pollution, that the part of the reason that issue was stuck was that political polarization had, in a sense, made climate change into this football, or an issue of the left that the right resisted instinctually and reflexively. So we shifted our focus of the think tank in 2014 to focus on political polarization. And we held a variety of high-level conclaves where we invited a lot of luminaries, a lot of political scientists and politicians and public intellectuals and like Jonathan Haidt or Thomas Mann. And we had a lot of people come to these conclaves. Some of them were held at SALON on the West Coast, and some of them were held in Austin, Texas. But after doing these conclaves for several years, I realized that the political perspective that we could see, that this application of integral philosophy to American politics really called for putting a stake in the ground about what we thought, what we believed. And so this book, Developmental Politics, I started writing it soon after Trump was elected, and it was just published March 1st. Now, obviously, March 1st is not a good time to publish any book. As soon as the book came out, the coronavirus shutdown was upon us. And certainly that's a major tragedy which rightfully eclipses politics. And the extent that it's eclipsed politics, Matt and Amy and I were talking about a little bit before we started, and there's some trends from the virus which has reduced polarization, at least temporarily, in terms of there's been some bipartisan stimulus packages, even though there's still rancor. There have been things accomplished that may not have been accomplished but for the pandemic. But we can also see effects in which the pandemic is exacerbating polarization. Like, for example, we now see the divide between people on the left generally seem to want to continue to shut down and continue to stay in place, whereas growing protests seems like working class Republicans are protesting against the shutdown and accusing people on the left of being insensitive to the costs of the shutdown. So these are in some ways just predictable exacerbations of this dysfunctional political condition we find ourselves in. But the situation, the reason, as I argue or explain carefully in Developmental Politics, the reason that American politics are so hyper polarized, and so there's so much bitterness, not just in politics, but across the culture. It's affecting almost every phase of American culture. We see this culture war. While a certain amount of conflict, a certain amount of division is built into the Constitution and is inevitable, in other words, there's quite a bit of research that shows that people's orientation to either embrace the right or the left is partially heritable. You know, people are born this way, but people are not born Trump supporters. This is something that is, as I argue in the book, is a symptom of polarization. Part of the way of understanding that is that over the last 50 years, American culture has evolved significantly. Not evenly, not across the board, but American culture's evolution has, in a sense, stretched it out to the point where we used to have two major worldviews, so sort of the traditional religious worldview and the mainstream worldview of modernity. And there was a kind of a cultural truce among these worldviews that prevailed after World War II and up until probably 1968. There was still quite a lot of cooperation between the Republican and Democratic parties. But beginning in the 60s, a third major worldview emerged on the cultural scene, which goes by many names. The formal name that I used for the book to describe this new form of culture is the progressive postmodern worldview. And while there's many different expressions of progressivism, and while it's not a uniform ideology, there's plenty of disagreement within progressive culture. But as I argue in the book, it nevertheless coheres as a cultural identity, a systemic worldview that has a kind of it's a form of culture that can be identified, that provides identity, that drives politics, that has brought many important new values like environmental priority and concern for those who've been marginalized and oppressed. There are many beautiful things about progressive culture, and I've been aligned with it my entire life. But I also recognize in the book that progressive culture has an existential dilemma, a problem that can't really be solved at the same level of thinking that created it. And that is that it can't, at least at this time in history, it can't garner an electoral majority, right? Despite the fact that it has, in some ways, the most evolved form of culture that is yet to appear. Progressive culture also has pathologies which are sort of threaten the mainstream in a way that people see progressivism only for its downsides. And over the last 4 years, the last 3.5 years since the election of Donald Trump, progressive culture has been empowered in certain ways, right? In other words, it's ever since the 1990s, it's been gaining cultural power. Right. So in some ways, we could say that progressivism has in many ways won the culture war at the level of culture. But at the level of politics, progressive culture is still stymied, as Trump's presidency testifies to, and as well as to the failure of Bernie Sanders to gain enough traction to become the Democratic candidate. Right. So progressive culture still has plenty of maturation to come, and it still has plenty of political power that it will continue to gain. But in other ways, it seems as though the people who are going to be persuaded to be progressive, that there are many people who continue to be persuaded, but there are still major blocks of American society who resist progressivism and see it only for its downsides. They see it for the way it sort of rejects much of what's come before, for the good and the bad. I mean, in its rejection of American history and its rejection of American modernity, many voices within progressivism unwittingly pose a cultural threat that is, in a sense, shooting themselves in the foot because it prevents them from gaining the electoral majorities they need to implement some of their needed progressive policies. So that's the sort of the diagnosis of the situation, is that American culture has been stretched out by its own growth, that progressive culture has brought many important new dignities, but it's also now been increasingly exposed for its downsides, which require further growth. So how do we get in the situation we grew ourselves into a disrupted society? So that's in some ways good and bad. That's the way evolution works. First, there's sort of a differentiation, and that either leads to a regression, a sort of a retrenchment, or in cases of successful, sustainable evolution, that differentiation leads to a higher level of integration. And so that's what developmental politics, that's what this book and the larger movement for developmental politics is attempting to achieve, is at least starting with a perspective that is kind of outside and above the culture war. It's a perspective that is sympathetic to progressive culture, but it tries to go beyond progressive culture by being even more inclusive than progressive cultures. Progressive culture, one of its strengths is that it's the most inclusive form of culture that has yet to appear. It wants to include those who've been marginalized. It wants to include a deeper concern for the environment and a deeper concern for structural problems, structural racism, structural oppression. These are all very important and needed forms of emergence. But not only is this perspective, this, if you'll pardon the term, post-progressive, but sort of trans-progressive, it wants to transcend and include progressivism. It wants to go beyond the rejection, the antithesis, the sort of the way in which progressive culture stands as a criticism, as a rightful critique to the rest of the society. It wants to take that critique and move from an antithesis to a more synthetic position, to a synthesis that can include the values of the mainstream in a way that current progressive discourse has a hard time doing. And by being more sympathetic, by integrating values from across the political spectrum into a larger synthesis, this new post-progressive political position is attempting, in a sense, to further progressive political goals in ways that it's not been able to achieve on its own. So, to be specific, as an example, right? This new perspective brings a kind of a method, a political method, and the best way to think about this method is increased cultural intelligence. So cultural intelligence is a little bit like emotional intelligence, right? It was sort of recently realized that there was this thing called emotional intelligence, that it was worth having, and it became a kind of an intellectual fad in a way, and then every CEO wanted to have emotional intelligence in their leadership style. And so that was an important development over the last 20 years, is this recognition of how important emotional intelligence is to leadership, to politics, to organizations. Well, in the same way that emotional intelligence has been promoted, we're now promoting this idea of cultural intelligence. And cultural intelligence it's a method of recognizing culture, recognizing it more clearly, right? From some perspectives, culture is just a sprawling bush, impossible to understand, made up of millions and millions of different agreements and subcultures, and a sort of a chaotic contingent confusion. But developmental politics and the integral philosophy that is behind it is able to look at culture and see some structure. These structures are not determinative, but they're nevertheless part of the larger structure of evolutionary emergence, right? These structures are, as I mentioned, worldviews. Worldviews are real cultural structures. They're not physical things, but they're not just in people's minds either. They exist sort of in the space between us, in the agreement space. And these cultural agreements, especially when they concern values and what the good life is, what's really deep down beautiful, true, and good, those kind of agreements have a natural systemicity, if you will. They cohere systemically and they persist across multiple generations. Even though they change and evolve, they also remain the same. Their core agreements, their core values show tenacious intergenerational continuity. And so now we have these three major worldviews. And so from within the purview of any one of these major worldviews, religious traditionalism, mainstream modernity, and this progressive postmodern worldview, within the identity frame, the values frame of any one of these worldviews, the others look wrong-headed, even toxic. And while that's true to a degree, I mean, each one of these worldviews has pathologies, right, which we need to overcome and transcend. But every one of these worldviews also has bedrock values that, from this perspective, form a larger interdependent cultural ecosystem, right? That is the traditionalism, that the religious worldview is not just a mythic fairy tale. It's not just a sexist and homophobic nightmare. While it certainly has those pathologies, it's also got very important values that are still needed in the larger structure of our evolving situation, our evolving civilization. So learning how to recognize the good parts, to tease apart the good from the bad within traditionalism, the good from the bad within mainstream modernity, and even the good from the bad within progressivism, that's what cultural intelligence does. That's how it works as a political method. And once the dignities have been distinguished from the disasters, once we're able to see the good of each one of these worldviews, while continuing to acknowledge the abiding pathologies, that allows this method of a political approach to begin to integrate values in a way that can make political progress. And the main example of this that I use in the book is the success of gay marriage, right? Despite the fact that even before Trump's election, throughout this decade and before, that as our government has been gridlocked, almost anything, any positive program from any side of the aisle is, the other side has an effective veto on that. Francis Fukuyama calls it a vetocracy, because basically it's a stalemate. And yet, despite the political polarization and the stalemate that we've been in, one issue stands out as making progress not only politically and legally, but also socially, and that is the right for gay people to get married. That has now become, even though there's still people who are against it, there's still people who protest against it, by and large, it's succeeded as much as any issue could possibly succeed, and rapidly. And part of the reason that has been able to advance where other issues remain stuck is that the issue of gay marriage integrates values from across the political spectrum, right? Not only does it forward progressive values that want to see gay people recognized as legitimate citizens and destigmatized, and not only does it forward progressive democratic values for people who want to see fairness. They want to see basically the right to marry is like a basic human right that should be extended to everyone. It also forwards conservative values in some very interesting ways. So, like, even though religious traditionalists may oppose gay marriage, the right for people to get married nevertheless forwards traditional family values. Those traditional values are baked into it, regardless of whether traditional people assent to it or not, right? Same thing with libertarian values, right? That as the government, according to libertarians, they're on the right, but they recognize that gay people the government shouldn't be in the business of saying who can get married and who can't get married depending on their sex, or otherwise enforcing religious doctrine, which has no place in our secular society. So by virtue of all these values being integrated into the issue, it was able to advance. And another example that I use in the book is of a stuck issue, which could likewise advance if there were values from across the political spectrum, these bedrock values, if those were integrated into the advocacy and into the policy that people are advocating, would be immigration, right? So we want a fair immigration system. We want a compassionate immigration system. We don't want to see any more children detained at the border. We don't want to see any more of the nightmares that we see from the Trump administration. But yet, even before Trump, immigration has been stuck. It's been stuck for 30 years. And yet this is an urgent issue. My parents were immigrants. I think that immigration is the lifeblood of the American society. So I want to see a fair and open society. But at the same time, the people on the right, to the extent that the people who are advocating for a fair immigration system are not integrating any values on the right. They're not concerned. They're not being mindful or trying to legitimize some of the positive values that are there, that even nationalism and globalism are interdependent in a way, the positive side of nationalism and the positive side of globalism. So this method of applying cultural intelligence to increase the value, density or the value integration of any particular issue to further it politically is a method that I outlined in detail in the book. And I've given you a little taste of it now. There's certainly much more to say, but it's been about half an hour, and I want to have an open discussion about this or any issue related to American politics or developmental politics in particular.
Thank you, Steve. Awesome. Let's give a clap for Steve. We'll use that to turn our Marcos, I do think you have a bit of an echo. So sorry. But we're gonna open it up to Q&A. Feel like, don't be afraid of asking a question. Really, you can ask any question you want.
So I have a question.
Yeah, John.
So I really resonate with your perspective. I grew up in the Midwest, and I know full well there's a strata of our society that resonates with what you're saying. There's also a strata that says, I want to win. And I'm not going to compromise with you. And, to be quite honest, I have a brother that kind of has that perspective. So how do you deal with that? That the group that says, my view is the one that has to dominate.
Sure. Go on.
You have to discuss things. How do you deal with that?
Well, I would say that the most pragmatic method is first to understand that we live in a democracy, right? And so, maybe not, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, right? But a majority of electoral votes, which is certainly possible, that would be a good start, right? In other words, in this perspective of developmental politics, we don't want to just vilify the right. I mean, the opportunity for evolution is to help people who are progressive to evolve into this post-progressive perspective in a way that makes progressivism less threatening to the mainstream, so we can persuade a politically significant number of people who voted for Trump that they don't need to vote for Trump, right? So part of it is that there are people like the person you mentioned who are stubborn, who don't want to compromise, who want to take a winner-take-all kind of predatory approach to politics. There may be some people in that category who we can persuade, and there may be people in that category who we'd never persuade. But that's the beauty of the democracy. You don't have to persuade everybody, right? You just have to persuade enough people to get a majority in the Electoral College. Then, ideally, you have to govern in a way that you can get 60% of that there's enough people in the opposition that are willing to go along for it because they recognize that you're coming from a sense of good faith.
Right.
And so part of that is understanding that the 63 million people who voted for Donald Trump, while some of them are certainly people who are unreachable or unpersuadable, there are many people in that category of American millions who are people of good sense and good faith, despite the fact that they voted for Trump. And so why would they do that? Why would they send this person to the White House to, horrify and torment us as he's done for these past few years? I mean, go ahead and be partisan about this. There's really no way to discuss it. You can't try to be in the middle. So I definitely want to see us overcome not just Trump, but Trumpism. And part of the way that has to happen is that we have to understand why people sent him to us, right? The 25% of Americans who are evangelical Christians. How could they be so hypocritical to send Donald Trump to office? Well, if we look at them sympathetically, if we say, why would they do that? One answer is that they see progressivism, the rise of progressivism, both in terms of its providing the moral system for, much of corporate America, the way that it's now, dominates American universities. But like I said at the beginning of my talk, how in some ways progressivism has won the culture war, right, for good, right, for important things, but that they see progressivism's pathologies, and they see it as a cultural threat. They see it as dissolving everything that they love, that their very identity is threatened by the cultural ascendancy of progressive culture and its values. And so understanding that cultural threat helps us see that they sent Trump as their cultural bodyguard. You know, they needed a tough guy to push back, somebody that wouldn't be sort of all in the middle, you know, like George W. Bush, or, I mean, he was right wing, but he was accommodationist. He wanted to sort of create a big tent. Trump is unabashedly anti-progressive. Almost every word that comes out of his mouth is carefully calculated to diss progressives and their culture. And that's exactly what the people who fear progressivism want to see. So one of the ways that we can defeat Trumpism, one of the ways that we can persuade at least part of the people that you mentioned, is by taking responsibility for the threats of progressivism, taking responsibility for the negatives of those, and evolving our way from this antithesis that rejects much of the best that's come before to a synthesis that can better include not just these other forms of politics, but these other people in our democracy who we're bound to. You know, they are us. And so we have a duty to try to persuade them and not just put them in the category of deplorables or just double down on the culture war, because that's clearly shown to be a losing strategy. So we progressives have to look in the mirror and say, we're partially responsible for the situation. How can we remedy it? And further evolution, further growth is what I'm recommending.
Right. But at the same time, there's a large group of our society that is against abortion and is against transgender. And how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, there are several levels that have to be dealt with. One is we have to win the election, right? We have to defeat Trump. Okay, we live in a democracy. So we can forward transgender rights. We can maintain, the abortion freedoms for women. Control over their bodies. That's like a basic personal freedom that is now enshrined within modernity. We can win politically against those things, even as we are able to carry forward some of the good that is there at the traditionalism. And so in some ways, there are many things within traditionalism that if they were not as culturally threatened, then they would be less politically powerful. Their own cultural threat is sort of what gives them this power. And it mobilizes them, it energizes them. So dealing with these progressive concerns, first we have to evolve the culture, and that can help us win politically.
So guys, again, no stupid questions. Like, we want as many questions as we can in these next 20 or so minutes. Yeah, Mason.
Yeah, Steve, I'm wondering if you could maybe on the same, along the same train of thought, if I'm a progressive person and you're, I'm ready to level up. Like I recognize that whatever I'm doing isn't quite working and that we're in a stalemate here. How maybe you could go a layer deeper in terms of pointing out the progressive pathologies and how those can be resolved, or like graduate. How would one graduate from those into a different orientation?
Yeah, excellent question. Thanks for that. Well, the short answer, and this is something that I have made several 5-minute videos about, and I have an article coming out in Aereo magazine on Wednesday that details some of this in written form where it's easier to unpack. So I can point you to that and to my website. But just to answer here, part of progressivism's pathologies, part of the cultural threat, which progressives themselves have a hard time understanding why they're threatening to the mainstream, has to do with this. The dignities are woven together with the disasters. In other words, part of the way that progressivism made its cultural advance, part of the way it emerged as a cultural structure initially in the 60s, gained traction in the 90s, and has now won the culture war in many important respects in this century, is that it gained its political energy by the unsustainable pathologies of modernity itself, right? The fact that modernism was destroying the environment, the fact that modernism was perpetrating these global wars like Vietnam, the fact that modernism was in sort of complicity with traditionalism to perpetrate sexism, racism, homophobia, that it wasn't concerned enough about these pathologies. So the spirit of liberation, of even a kind of a revolution, was a very positive thing that helped progressivism break out of modernity as a cultural structure and achieve its own momentum, its own freestanding identity. And this move of antithesis, you know, as Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, saw 200 years ago, this is how evolution occurs, right? First, there's a breaking out. And that's a very important move because they were sick of it. You know, the slogan was turn on, tune in, drop out. Reject modern society, right? For very good reasons. So this same rejectionistic spirit of liberation, that's one of the major strengths of progressivism, right? But tied directly to that same move of rejection is this failure to recognize the interdependence. How progressive culture itself only emerges in a sustainable way in societies that have created the conditions of relative wealth and freedom. That is what modernity creates. Modernism emerges in the Enlightenment, and in the countries that have managed to become center of gravity modernist in their culture and in their economy, these societies have provided this tremendous enrichment for even the average person, even though there's still gross inequality, even though there's still major problems, right? Nevertheless, for 40,000 years, humans lived, the vast majority of humans lived on the equivalent of about $2 a day in modern currency terms. And people in the developed world now live at the average person, right? Not rich people. The average person lives on about $150 a day. That's a massive enrichment. And one of the benefits of that enrichment and the freedom, a society of individual rights and rule of law, where you can have free speech, right? Where you're not in a police state where they throw you in jail if you protest. Those are the conditions of modernity. And it's in those very conditions, those are the necessary preconditions for progressive culture to emerge. So if progressive culture wants to eliminate modernity, it's like climbing to the, as Don Beck says, you know, it's climbing to the top of the house with a ladder and then throwing the ladder down that got it up there. So this recognition of the interdependence, how the achievements of modernity create the conditions for this progressive recognition of modernity's unsustainability. But the idea that we can just wipe out modernity and go back to a pre-modern condition, I mean, that might work for one generation. But as so many people have found, progressive people, when they move to the country, they create a commune and their kids grow up in a rural setting and they all become rednecks because it's this situation where they're in a pre-modern economic and political and cultural environment. And while progressive culture can be transplanted there, progressive culture thrives in these other conditions, these urban conditions, these dense conditions. So recognizing the interdependence of how evolution works at every level. Or in other words, evolution doesn't just wipe out what came before. I mean, cosmological evolution of the periodic table of elements, biological evolution of the tree of life, and the cultural evolution of human consciousness and history, these all share a similar pattern where there's the way advance is made, the way things are made better, is that the achievements of one level are taken up and used by the next level. Right? Like cells become organs, organs become bodies, bodies become more and more complex. And so we see this pattern of evolution. In order to make it sustainable and continue to be a platform for further growth, there has to be this way in which the achievements of the old are carried forward in the new. Right? Evolution grows from within itself, bringing forward what came before. And so progressivism as a cultural, protest has made an important move. But in order for it to be sustainable evolutionarily, it needs to better integrate what came before. It needs to be more sympathetic and move from this spirit of staunch rejectionism to a more inclusive position that can understand how progressivism depends on a functional modernity, and modernity itself depends on at least some degree of a preservation of the achievements of the traditional level that bring about values like duty and honor and fair play and respect for the family and patriotism. All those things can't stand alone, but they're part of the structure. It's an interdependent ecosystem. And so if we get rid of the foundation of the ecosystem, the whole thing becomes unsustainable. So making American culture more functional so that it can support further evolution, right, that can achieve the laudable goals of progressivism while preserving the best of what's come before. That's how we approach recognizing, the The pathologies of progressivism provide our points of departure. So those include this anti-modernism, this sort of rejection of modernity. It includes reverse patriotism, right? The characterization of American history as nothing but a sinister criminal enterprise, right? Certainly patriotism needs to be tempered. Certainly America's misdeeds need to be atoned for. Certainly we still have work to do to overcome the legacy of the crimes of America's past. But if we just characterize America as negative, if we have what I'm calling reverse patriotism, where America is simply bad and any expressions of patriotism are cringeworthy, that's a pathology. It may not seem like a pathology to progressives, but it's certainly politically costly to otherwise laudable progressive goals. So for progressives to understand anti-modernism, reverse patriotism, even the downsides of identity politics are seen as very much a cultural threat to the rest of the American society. So owning up to those, recognizing that they're woven together with a strength, so it's not easily just jettisoned, but there's a way in which further growth progressives themselves can begin to create a discourse wherein the more harsh voices of anti-modernism and reverse patriotism can be addressed in a gentle way. So part of it is like homophobia, sexism, the pathologies of traditionalism, racism, those are never going to be completely eliminated until traditionalists themselves no longer stand for it, right? Same with modernity, it's gross inequality, it's environmental degradation. Until modernists themselves are no longer willing to tolerate that, it's never going to be fully remedied. And the same can be said with these politically self-sabotaging pathologies of progressivism that progressives themselves can take responsibility for ameliorating.
Go, Lehman.
Yeah, Steve, what do you make of the argument that there is a strong bipartisan corporatist politics that kind of promotes, maybe even creates a scary left and a scary right in order to maintain its power structure at a perceived center?
Well, certainly the business model of the corporate media is to drive outrage, to drive conflict, because it's so competitive and so financially precarious, and because there's this strange mix of people like Ezra Klein, who founds Vox, not just to be a media mogul, but because he really wants to see progressive ideas forward. And he's got a higher purpose to it. It's not just cynical capitalism. But nevertheless, I mean, you could even say that about any of these major media outlets, that there are actors within there who are true believers politically and believe that the politicization of the media, right? It's being divided into Fox News and MSNBC, right? That same dysfunctional media environment which thrives on outrage and then becomes a kind of a polarization industry, right? Where it's exacerbating polarization wherever possible for its own financial gain. That's certainly, a negative. It's certainly something that we need to address as part, with cultural intelligence. I think one of the benefits of gaining a political perspective that people can identify and the media starts to pay attention to, right? So, like, for example, a feminist perspective is something that was never on the radar screen of corporatist America, but now you see a lot of feminist voices that are part of the dialogue. And so trying to build visibility and credibility for a post-progressive political perspective, or this cultural intelligence, whatever buzzword happens to catch on, right? If you can have a CNN analyst who says, well, from the perspective of cultural intelligence, you could call them on their polarization baiting, right? You could call them on their clickbaiting, at least to some degree, but at the same time, at the same time that the media, the corporate mainstream media, has itself become dysfunctional. It's a sort of a casualty of the polarization, right? It's been divided. There used to be Walter Cronkite, right? We used to have this kind of centrist media that you trust to be unbiased and fair. Well, that's gone by the wayside, partially because there is no political center anymore, right? It's like a strong magnet. You're pulled to one side or the other. So part of the counterbalance of this unfortunate commercial distortion of our media is that the media has been more democratized than ever before, right? So we can have this Zoom meeting and the corporate media is not controlling it, and we can say whatever we want, right? And this could grow virally, right? We could have a Zoom meeting with thousands of people on it if we, struck a nerve and got the propositions right. So, there's a safety valve in the media being sort of controlled in a venal way, that's making things worse or is part of the problem. And that is this, the fact that we can all become media makers of our own. And, we're doing that. Part of it is just gaining traction. And I think we're all working on that from different angles. You are, I am, we're trying to participate. I think we share this higher purpose of cultural evolution, and we want to see it forwarded. And, it's not easy. It's tricky. Sometimes you have to wait for grace. In other words, it's not something you can engineer, right? We're gardening for emergence. It's a living thing that has to grow. But, certainly if the presidency of Donald Trump and the real chance that he could actually be reelected, I mean, come on, this is a very dire situation. If there isn't a problematic life condition that can stimulate further evolution, I mean, we've got it, right? We're not going to get a more urgent or, evolution stimulating problematic life condition than this one. And so hopefully, it won't continue for another 4 years, but if it does, that's going to put even more pressure on us to try to create political evolution as we can. I can say one more thing about the corporatist media. Part of anti-modernism, right, the progressive pathology, is to see corporations in general, American business as a whole, as a kind of an evil, exploitive, greedy entity that's sucking the blood of the people, right? And certainly there are many things about corporate America which indeed are evil and need to be called out, and it's dysfunctional, and I think that the word evil can be rightfully applied to many elements, right? But there's also ways in which much of anti-capitalism was formed in the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution, when it was a Dickensian nightmare of the highest order, right? And this is like the dark satanic mills, right? Capitalism is the greatest evil. It's worse than being conquered by an army. And that was completely understandable. And while certainly those conditions continue to exist in many places, and there's the Dickensian nightmares in Bangladesh, and it's certainly an ongoing problem. But at the same time, business, American business, at least some of them, have been a force for good, right? They have aligned themselves with progressive values in many ways, right? That is, so I would say I'm pro-business. I don't see corporations as sort of an evil per se. I see business as an aspect of modernity that can be a force for good or bad. It's been a force for bad. It's certainly been a force for good in a way. And I think it can continue to be a force for good. And if we just vilify anything that has to do with business as greedy capitalism, then I think we're going to miss a chance to recruit the power of business to our larger goals of cultural evolution.
I think, Pamela, you had a question?
It just seems to me that what is really needed is each of us needs to become a mediator. We need to be able to find the center in ourselves in between extremities. But that means pushing ourselves out of one of our corners. And I mean, that takes time and effort. And can we do that before November? I mean, I totally agree with everything you're saying, but it's like there is so much demanded of us in this. In other words, we have to educate ourselves. I mean, I have learned so much from you about culture and worldview, and especially the integral, all-inclusive that has to look at all the pieces. And it's like, how many of us are even aware of that reality, And there's a lot that is demanded of us. And I guess now the term mediation is the one that kind of came up for me. Somehow finding a center so that so that we can talk, but we can allow ourselves to see a positive in say a Trumpster. What you said about get to know them, find out why they're, one of the things I see in them is they're so insecure. So they have major security issues. So it's like, no, I understand that about them. So in other words, but there's a lot more, and it's like there's just a lot of time and energy that we need to put into this to really be effective balancers of all this.
Sure. Well, I love the way you use the term mediation. In some ways, that's a description of what cultural intelligence attempts to do. Not mediating necessarily by solving an argument between two people who are bitterly opposed, but like in our own political positions, right? That is, we don't have to wait for somebody to argue for their side because we can see the bedrock values that are behind what's animating their position. And we can give those the bedrock values, the core good that they stand for. If there's a way that we can acknowledge that and do the mediation within our own viewpoint, within our own particular political position, that's what's going to persuade a politically significant number of people who are currently alienated from the left. So, part of it, what can we do between now and November? As individual citizens, one of the things we can do in championing Joe Biden's candidacy, for example, is to be aware that language of hate against not just Trump, but Trump supporters, that's counterproductive. Certainly, I'll say it, plainly, Trump is a scourge on our society, right? So we need to eliminate Trump, but we need to eliminate the impulse that 63 million Americans felt they needed a cultural bodyguard because the best of what they stand for is being dissolved by this newly emergent form of culture. That's something we can take responsibility for in our political rhetoric, right? When we write a comment, when we talk to a friend, when we post online, almost anything we can do. If we're fueling the hate, then we're part of the problem.
Right.
And if we're mediating, as you said, not necessarily by trying to act as a physical mediator in an argument, oh, that's good where you can do it, but more just being cultural mediators in what we stand for and how we think about politics and how we talk about it with our friends and colleagues.
Yes, I know, and I wonder how many of us actually take the time to question values. In other words, that's the core of what you're talking about, is that we want to, the truth, beauty, and goodness values. Yes, I totally agree. I feel that's central to everything. And it's like, but then there's all the different levels of values from the different worldviews. And so it's like, we have to be educated enough to really know what worldview that person's coming from. And so what are the values from that world? In other words, it takes a lot of time.
Sure. Well, we all share the same values in some ways, right? We all care about the good, the true, and the beautiful in the abstract, right? But when you translate those to political parties and positions, they get divisive. But just like people didn't really think, leaders, organizers, didn't think about emotional intelligence prior to 1995, right? Some people were naturally sensitive to emotions, but thinking about being emotionally intelligent was not on anybody's radar screen, and not in a large scale way. But in the same way that emotional intelligence as something that's a practice, that's an approach, that's a form of awareness, that's now helped evolve our society in important ways. People are aware of their tone. They're aware of the emotions of other people. They practice reading emotions. These are all important skills, right? That cultural intelligence is the same way. Cultural intelligence is an awareness of values and the values that are behind people's political positions. Even if they may not be able to articulate those values themselves, every one of these major cultural worldviews that I talked about is like a channel of the upward current of the good. It's like they have their own horizon, their own octave of the beautiful, the true, and the good. And part of those evolutionary achievements that have come from the working out of those values are creating the society that we rely on today. So being able to see those values and carry them forward, even while we prune away and reject the pathologies that are naturally associated with those values, That's a practice. It's a political method that I think can make real progress in making sure that we never have another president like Trump.
Could I just say something?
Sure.
Yeah.
I read a good thing. I forgot where it was, but it was about storytelling in American politics, and what it was suggesting was Obama was almost too good because he like combined sort of straightforward ideology with the sort of storytelling tradition of, if you think back to, I don't know, sort of the 30s or 40s, you know, the standard sort of Southern politician telling stories about, oh, when I grew up around this area, my daddy used to drive a tractor or whatever, and I'll be good for you. And what he was suggesting was you need to respect the culture of the poorer parts of America, which is more, it sounds weird to say an oral culture, like ancient Greece or something, but it's more of a storytelling thing, and they're less interested in like analytical analysis of the sort of here and now of American culture. And I can't quite express it, but he's just said like people thought they would like Trump because he looks like a bit of a storyteller and they've seen him on TV, but actually he's not even good at telling stories. Like, but he was saying that America would benefit from someone who's not a psychopath, and B can sort of mold the American experience into a story that would like make sense to the poorer elements of society, that would include them, and not just to sort of trick them into voting for a progressive, but would really give them a sense of country and of pride, which I thought was quite interesting.
Sure. Well, I mean, stories are certainly part of the substance of these worldviews. You know, that's how these values are taught and transmitted. And then the stories are what allow people to attach their identity to these worldview structures. That kind of provides them a sense of identity. It gives them a political ground to stand on and a sense of what they stand for, right? So the stories are very important. I would say that the ability to transmit values and persuade people. I mean, you know, stories have gained a lot of cultural traction, like in the publishing industry. That's what all they want is stories. You know, my trouble is that I get a book, I read the book, and it's full of stories. I skip through the story. I don't want to read the story. I want to read the point.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I acknowledge that stories are very important, and that we want to, that part of honoring these worldviews is honoring their stories, right? Seeing how those stories are the carriers of these bedrock values that I spoke to, and how they're, you know, carrying forward the values, the positive values involves carrying forward the stories and making those stories our own, right? So the story of modernity, the Horatio Alger story of getting rich, right? That's a story that can be translated to higher level. There could be a progressive version of that story. There could be a post-progressive version of that story. You know, the traditional biblical stories, right? You know, anything having to do with the Bible is seen as repulsive to progressives for evolutionarily understandable reasons. But those Bible stories they're not just going to go away. We're not going to just erase those from our history. Those are going to come back in a way that can re-include, you know, the wisdom of progressivism without the sexism, homophobia, and racism that goes with it, right? So carrying forward the stories is a sort of undeveloped part of this cultural intelligence that I'm talking about, and I'm glad you brought it up.
Roy?
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much. My name is Roy, and I'm from Japan.
Hi, Roy.
I have a question about social inclusion. I think social inclusion is really important. For example, the young generation, like my age, I'm apparently young, I'm 22 right now. Those generation are kind of indifferent for politics, I think. And I think in terms of American election also, that our generation is the lowest the portion of voters, I think, you know. So those are problem, I think, because we have to bring those generation into the political field. Otherwise, in couple of years, in 10 years, 20 years, the generation who has to take over this political field is our generation. So from this stage, early stage, we have to include them into this political field. So I just want to ask you your opinion about this specific topic.
I think it's very important. You know, I have two sons, 14 and 26.
Mhm.
My 26-year-old, the problem that you just mentioned, you know, I have to twist his arm to get him to vote.
Yeah.
You know, I have to talk to him about his ancestors dying for his right to vote. And I have to just browbeat him into doing it, right? And he doesn't like it and I don't like it, but, you know, he has voted the past couple of elections. But it's the fact that he doesn't naturally take to it. I mean, I did, you know, in 1980, I cast my first vote when I was 20 years old for Jimmy Carter. Of course, he lost. But you know, I didn't, you know, voting just seemed like a duty. It just seemed like that I was an American and I identified an American, and voting was part of what was expected of me and what I expected of myself. The fact that so many young people have been alienated from the democratic process is itself a acute political problem. Part of it will be solved by economic progress as young people as young people gain property, as they become more invested in the economy, that'll naturally engage them with politics more. But I think part of it is also some of the after effects of this reverse patriotism that I spoke about, right? If America is just a sinister criminal enterprise, and if the politics is controlling the cynicism that says that politics is controlled by billionaires, it's just a plutocracy, then that makes you feel like you're a dupe if you're voting, or you're just a sucker. So part of these pathologies of cynicism and reverse patriotism that I mentioned, those pathologies have a fallout in alienating politically many young people. So I think addressing those pathologies is at least part of the solution to voter apathy among young people.
I see. But also, like, I'm kind of concerning over the fake news. I think the proportion of the fake news in the online websites or wherever it is kind of confusing young generation. For example, in terms of philosophy, of course, the belief, what we have to believe in terms of politics, in terms of our daily behavior, it doesn't really matter what it is. But those have to be maintained, I think, in the right way. Otherwise, younger generation believe the totally wrong belief, and their behavior, of course, accordingly would be wrong. So those concerns also we have to take it into consideration, I think, if we talk about politics, because everything is connected. And as you say, the cultural value is, I believe it's also including those kind of belief, because otherwise there won't be any integration of cultural value, which will be generated from those maintained belief. So I want you to, answer this question as well. What do you think about this kind of a specific topic? I'm sorry, my English is
No, those are great. Those are great questions. I really appreciate you bringing those up.
Same things back in Japan as well. I can see the same kind of indication. So that's why I just want to ask you.
Well, but certainly fake news is part of the corruption of the media, right? That Layman and I spoke about a few minutes ago. But it's particularly acute in this democratized social, virtual media that has, been proliferating, especially since the virus. So it's an emergent condition of the freedom that goes with this democratization of media, right? And it's certainly something that needs to be countered. The corporate media can't counter it because they're in the ratings war and they're fueling the culture war. They're cultural warriors. So they can't be trusted anymore. It sort of relates to the reason why centrism itself is not viable, right? So a lot of the prescriptions for this post-progressive political position look a little bit reminiscent of centrism, right? We're trying to bring things together, but it's not centrism, because contemporary political centrism essentially is the middle of modernity trying to cut off the edges, right? Trying to see the far left as just, as lunatic as the far right. But in reality, the far left is in some ways the leading edge of evolution. We don't want to cut that off. We want to build on that, right? So we need to advance a kind of media that can gain trust as being, legitimately coming from this perspective of outside and above. So centrist modernity can no longer take that position because it's been transcended. But to go beyond progressivism into this outside and above perspective and trying to create some media that isn't just automatically biased to the left or biased to the right.
Yeah.
Doesn't try to achieve an impossible centrism either, but is able to sympathetically appreciate all these different cultural structures and see them all for their good and their bad. A media platform that was informed by that kind of thinking, I would say, can begin to gain trust, because you could trust it not to either be fueling the culture war or not policing fake news. I mean, policing fake news is so difficult because, as we see with Facebook's efforts, I don't know whether you followed it, but they just appointed a commission, to try to diminish hate speech, and I think that it's a real problem. They have to address it. They're trying to address it. I applaud them for that. But I don't think what their approach is particularly effective or going to be. And I think that the danger of Facebook becoming the new, big brother that's a real concern, because that is, if you're green, if you're a progressive yourself, then you have a very hard time deciding what's fake news or being a fair broker.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so, that is, until we can break out of progressivism itself, we won't be able to recognize how our own well-intentioned progressive sensibilities are what is keeping us from addressing fake news.
I completely agree. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you for good questions.
Guys, we can take one more question if anyone has it.
I do. If
Yeah.
no one else does.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing this. Appreciate it. Just curious what your thoughts are. If you ever think about there possibly being a threshold to diversity and inclusivity, where once this threshold is passed, the central identity or rather cohesion of a society will disintegrate and possibly follow with the regression to tribal communities?
Sure. Well, what an excellent, important question that is. I mean, that is in some ways one of the central challenges of progressivism itself. And one way to think about it is that each one of these worldviews that I talked about is channeling this kind of value energy. It's channeling higher causes that it stands for. And so some of the primary higher causes of progressive culture and politics is planetary healing, right? Reducing the destruction of global warming and other kinds of pollution, and including those who've been marginalized, combating sexism, racism, homophobia. These with efforts to make our leadership, our media, everybody in the society, we want to increase diversity. Diversity itself is a line of evolution, right? The more we can make things diverse, that's making things better in very important ways, okay? But that's a higher cause, a higher calling, a higher principle that is necessarily needs to be, in order for it to achieve the fullness of the better world it wants to make, it has to work with and be integrated with other higher causes, which it can tend to trample on. In other words, it needs a limiting principle. If there's no limiting principle to diversity, right? If diversity becomes your goal and you are empowered to achieve your goal, then diversity can take over everything, right? Let's have a diverse NBA, right? That is, they're not, people are not equally represented in the National Basketball Association, right? So if we have diversity as our only goal, then we ought to have the basketball teams representative of the society, right? That would be a logical extension of diversity. But that seems absurd because we want to see a good basketball game. We want to see whoever's the best basketball player. We want to let them. So we don't want to just have meritocracy alone, right? Meritocracy has its own pathologies. But just like meritocracy needs a limiting principle because it's a higher cause that has to work with and be integrated with other higher causes, progressive higher causes likewise need integration, lest they go so far as that the fact that they're making the world better, but they're also starting to make the world worse or create new problems that empower other forces that can undo much of the good that diversity has achieved. So I'm for diversity, I'm for integration, I'm for these progressive values, but I want to see them forwarded in a way that's better integrated and better aware of these other very important higher purposes which we need if we're going to continue to make progress. So then the limiting principle, of course, is right now Trump. He's the giant limiting principle on progressivism, but that's the wrong kind of limiting principle, right? Ideally, progressives themselves would recognize their own limiting principles and say, look, we care very much about diversity. This is our main political goal right now, is to achieve that. And that's laudable. And that's something that I support. But the very own good that they're trying to do with that, they need to be thoughtful and they need to be culturally intelligent about how they go about forwarding that good, so that very good doesn't become, the cultural threat that empowers all these people on the right.
All right. Well, with that, I'd like to thank Steve so much for pioneering our first virtual philosophy salon. It was awesome. Let's give her a hand for him.
Thanks very much for the great questions. You all made it good, because those are all really thoughtful questions, every one.
Yeah, they certainly were. And we will be doing this every week. We'll have a different thought leader leading a discussion on different kind of philosophy topics. Actually, someone who's doing next week, Layman Pascal, he'll be leading the conversation next week on post-metaphysical spirituality. And it's gonna be a great topic. He'll explain what that means later.
I'll come for that.
And with that, we're a Brooklyn DIY kind of scrappy venue called the Tiny Cupboard. We normally do music and comedy, but we're starting to get into a more philosophy and other kinds of things now. We'll send a follow-up email with more of Steve's information, so you can go deeper into the book and continue the conversation, and then more of our information as well in an email. We actually are hosting another event in 10 minutes, so we have to go. But
okay.
But thank you guys so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you,
Thanks, Matt and Amy. Nice job. All right, be well.
All right.
Everyone.
Thank you.